Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Hines. I'm Executive Director of the Charleston Conference, and I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webcast, Artificial Intelligence in Scholarly Research, Part 1, Artificial Intelligence versus Intelligent Augmentation. Before we have our presentation today, I have just a few quick housekeeping announcements for you. This session is going to be recorded, and a link to the video will be provided to everyone who registered today. That'll be sent out within, probably within the next 2 days. And then the link will contain the, I'm sorry, I'm stumbling right now, a link to the video of the recorded session. We're going to be saving questions till the end. There are quite a lot of people who registered for today's session, which is a good thing, but it may mean that we might not get to all the questions at the end, but we'll address as many as we can. And I'll have a slide at the closing with an email for contact if we don't quite get to your question at the end. There will also be a short attendee evaluation after the session finishes. 3 questions, very minimal, but we would really appreciate your feedback. So this session is being hosted through Zoom. I know it's a joke right now, everybody is on Zoom and has used it, but in case you have never used Zoom for a webinar before, here's just a quick rundown. When you join, it'll ask you to use the computer or phone audio. You're probably going to get the best audio quality from your computer speakers. If you're having problems, you can reconnect using your phone. And if you're having issues, you can use the little chat bubble at the bottom here to send me a note, and I'll try to help address all tech issues as quickly as I can. There's also a raise and lower hand button, but we won't be using that for today's session. The main thing I want you to see here is the Q&A button. So if you have a question during the course of the conversation today, at any time you can input your question using that Q&A button, type your questions or comments and click send, and then we'll save those in a queue till the end. And our moderator will address those questions to the panelists. And with that, I am going to turn this over to today's moderator, Matthew Ismail. So Matthew, if you would like to take over with your introduction of the panelists and speakers, that would be great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Leah. My name is Matthew Ismail. I'm the editor of the Charleston Briefings and a conference director at the Charleston Conference. The Charleston Briefings, Trending Topics for Information Professionals, is a brief open access book series on the topic of innovation in the world of libraries and scholarly communication. The audience for the briefings is the same audience that attends the Charleston Conference, librarians, publishers, entrepreneurs in information technology, vendors and consultants. This series offers timely, readable, focused treatments of topics of significance to practitioners in these fields. The purpose of the series is to offer the readers with a useful overview that will allow them to engage more effectively with new trends and innovations in their industry. Now, this webcast is a conversation on artificial intelligence and intelligent augmentation, and it's based on Daniel Hook's chapter in our upcoming briefing called Artificial Intelligence in Scholarly Research. Now, let me just introduce our speakers. Daniel Hook has been CEO of Digital Science since 2015. Digital Science has supported and invested in several technologies for researchers that leverage artificial intelligence over the last few years, including, I hope I pronounced these correctly, Daniel, Repeta, Rightful, and Dimensions. In 2019, Daniel helped to launch the Research on Research Institute, which seeks to understand the process of translating research on research into practical improvements in how research is funded and carried out. He is also a policy fellow at the Center for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge, where he is studying how society trusts experts. Daniel originally trained as a theoretical physicist, and continues to be an active researcher, holding visiting positions at Imperial College London and Washington University in St. Louis. In his spare time, he continues to write academic papers in physics and is the co-author of a book on PT symmetric quantum theory. Ruth Pickering is the Chief Operating Officer of Yewno, a leading provider of augmented intelligence solutions with applications for higher education, publishing, and finance. Yewno's mission is to transform information into knowledge. Their award-winning work in solving the information overload problem has been widely recognized globally. Ruth was actually my initial contact when I sought an author for this briefing on AI and scholarly research. While I had hoped to have Ruth write this work herself, in the end, she used her connections to recruit a series of excellent authors, such as Daniel, to write individual chapters. So please welcome our very accomplished speakers for this conversation about artificial intelligence and intelligent augmentation.
Thank you very much, Leah and Matthew, firstly for the invitation to write the Charleston briefing. I've spent most of my career working in technology, so when I understood what was wanted for the briefing, I felt that there were people who are somewhat more expert than I am. So a second thank you to the wider group of authors who've helped work on this project. Today, I'm delighted to be sitting here having this conversation with Daniel, albeit in different countries. And first of all, I'd like to start with a question about terminology. So Daniel, you made the distinction between generalized artificial intelligence and intelligent augmentation. Please, can you explain the difference between them and why the distinction is so important?
Thanks, Ruth. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening, which I guess for many people on the call will be this afternoon or possibly even this morning. So I hope everybody is awake and has had their coffee or lunch or dinner, whatever is what is needed. I think this whole field of artificial intelligence is completely fascinating, and from my vantage point, I have quite a narrow view. But of course, there are many people who are much more studied in artificial intelligence and the current state of research in artificial intelligence than I am. But from reading up on the literature and doing preparation in this area to support successive investments in digital science and just wanting to be aware of the overall artificial intelligence landscape as an investor and as a technologist, there are a number of things that kind of stand out. And from my understanding of computer science and not being a computer scientist myself, AI seems to be something of a holy grail for computer science. And when I talk about generalized artificial intelligence, I'm really thinking about an artificial intelligence that is able to do many things. And in the sense that most artificial intelligences that we encounter today, and there are many, and many that you don't realize you're even interfacing with, they're typically doing quite narrow sets of tasks. So you might engage with an engine like Mendeley or an engine like ReadCube. These systems are using artificial intelligence behind the scenes. They're doing all sorts of clever calculations, which are what computer scientists might classically call machine learning. And they're trying to seek patterns out in particular sets of data and to try to provide you a recommendation or provide some kind of small augmented experience, let's say. And I think that is not AI in the sense that I've talked about in my book chapter, and that's not AI in the sense that I think a lot of people think about these things. Generalized AI, I think of as a non-specific AI, and AI is something that can duplicate human-like intelligence. So as humans, we have a wide experience in the world. We can do many things. We can interact with many people. We can anticipate highly non-standard situations, and we can learn to deal with those situations, both mentally and physically. And a generalized artificial intelligence should be capable of doing that, at least at the level that a human is able to perceive, interact with, and process the world around them. So that's the kind of thinking behind the definition of artificial intelligence or generalized artificial intelligence that I've thought of in the chapter that I've written.
Thanks very much, Daniel. So
I was just going to quickly say intelligent augmentation, on the other hand. Intelligent augmentation, on the other hand, is something that I think is actually very natural to humans. This is something that we've been doing. This is something that almost, not quite uniquely, but it certainly is a unique facet of our species, is that we are tool users. There are other tool users in the animal kingdom, but we are superlative at it. We are very good at pattern matching, and we're very good at creating tools for use. And so I think actually intelligent augmentation is the natural mode of running of humanity. We try to build things that enhance our ability to do things. It's what's interesting to me, and I think I point this out in the chapter, possibly in not a really pointy way, but one of the things is interesting is that generalized artificial intelligence tends to make people fearful because they have seen movies like Terminator and they're worried that Skynet is going to come and kill them. And they don't worry about intelligent augmentation because it's what we do as humans. But in fact, intelligent augmentation is a lot more insidious and still is much more dangerous to us as a civilization or as a society, because in fact, it's augmented intelligence or intelligent augmentation is what tends to lead to job losses. It's what tends to restructure society. It is what we're seeing going on and have been seeing going on for the last 20 years. And we are now at the beginning of the AI revolution, which will ultimately completely restructure our job market. And I think that's actually something to think about. It's not Skynet we should be worried about. It's actually the much more mundane level of AI that we have available to us. And there are, broadly speaking, two different types of industrial revolution. There are industrial revolutions which have, which breed technologies that replace people, and there are technologies that augment people. And the current revolution is starting now to go into a situation whereby we replace people. And that is really the context, I think, for much of the discussion this evening, much of the chapter that I wrote, and a lot of things that people are currently thinking about in the sector.
Great. So you've talked just a little bit now about how we've all been exposed to the idea of AI in fiction and in news headlines. And headlines that suggest that it could replace us can be quite alarming. So as a result, many people do have concerns, and you touched on some of them. You mentioned that humans are both creators and users of tools, and that AI can potentially be of great assistance in your chapter. Could you expand a little bit on that idea?
We're just thinking about this a little bit more specifically in the context of a research ecosystem. Perhaps that's a topic here to pick up on. I think people in research possibly think that they are more immune from AI coming into their lives than others. AI is often talked about as replacing low-skilled jobs, lower-level jobs. It's often talked about, certainly in a robotics context, about replacing repetitive tasks. And in research, we tend to think of ourselves as highly creative. We tend to think of ourselves as not doing mundane jobs, and jobs that are difficult to replicate, jobs that are highly nuanced and that require nuance. And certainly, I think if you look at science fiction, if you look at fiction, it does give you that vision of those, Mr. Data in Star Trek. He is very much a humanoid robot. Isaac Asimov writes a lot about humaniform robots. And so, we think about that as AI. But again, we are starting to move from that space where it's the low-level tasks, and we're starting to see AI is able to accomplish quite meaningful tasks. And this is really as a result of the processing power that has become available in the last few years and the amount of data that has become available in the last few years. So we start to see both robots and artificial intelligences able to perform tasks that are quite interesting, and even in a research context. So one company that is based in the Valley not far from you, Ruth, is a company called Transcriptic, which Digital Science took a position in a couple of years ago. And Transcriptic seeks to help people in the research lab perform experiments in a much more efficient way. So the company has come up with a language where you can program the steps of your experiment as you would program a computer. And what it then does is it has all of these shipping containers, which are contained labs, where you can set up all the things that you need in the lab, all your samples, your equipment, and you can program and chain steps together. And you can then say to the computer, now please run this experiment 500 times and scan this parameter range for me. And please do it efficiently. So don't just dumbly look through the parameter range. Please use the data that comes out of the experiment to work out where an interesting experimental area might be, and zero in on that and get me more data and more granularity around that area. So tools like this actually start moving into, I wouldn't say creativity, but certainly a level of functionality more than what we would have expected. You see this kind of leap in experimental expert systems as well. Many of you will have had the experience, I'm sure, where you've phoned up a company and you've wanted to interact with someone about paying a bill or something like this. Or in fact, you've had a problem and it asks you to explain the problem, and you speak into the phone, and it then constructs a reply for you out of the knowledge base. And you're not speaking with a human at all. The computer is actually highly successful now in bringing you from a conversation where you have a problem to a solution to that problem. And that would have been inconceivable 10 years ago, I think. So the technology is starting to come out of science fiction. And I think science fiction is an interesting motivator for a lot of what we're seeing in the world right now.
Thank you, Daniel. So while AI has been around for a while, it was only really when the internet made vast amounts of data available at scale, and with the advent of cloud computing, that it really started to take off. So what do you see as the most compelling applications today? And maybe starting off looking at this more generally.
Well, as I've indicated, I think the phone conversation is a really fascinating point. And I think that would probably be the thing that comes top of mind to me when I'm thinking about the greatest possibility for impact in daily lives, and at the same time the greatest potential impact for job losses or changes in how we conceptualize ourselves in the workplace. That said, if we think more broadly, the levels at which AI are able to pattern match generally are starting to have some really fascinating applications. There's a company based in Oxford in the UK called 1751 Labs. And 1751 Labs came out of the Galaxy Zoo project. Some of you may know that this was a project to look at many pictures of the night sky and to try to identify different smudges, effectively. What type of galaxy are these different light smudges on these different films? And the team in Oxford built this fantastic piece of technology which allows a large number of people to identify these smudges and say, this is a globular cluster. I'm out of touch with astrophysics, but these are different types of object. And then learn from those people what the characteristics are, to a level where now the technology itself knows how to do that. It no longer needs the humans to do it. It's learned enough for the humans, and it's become better than the humans. And this type of approach means that you can now use this technology to learn all sorts of different things and all sorts of different classifications. And I think you can, I mean, this was a wonderful piece of news right at the end of last year. Google Healthcare released news, I think it was actually on the 1st of January, whereby their computers are now more accurate, their algorithms are more accurate at reading cancer assays than doctors themselves. So we are at this really interesting pivot point where there are some things that historically humans have been better pattern matchers than anything else on the planet. And we've now got to a level where we're teaching machines to be better pattern matchers than we are. And I think that's a fascinating point to be at. The story which I will give you, which doesn't work, which I think is completely fascinating, is, and I talk about this in the chapter, is about one of creativity. And I'm not sure what really classifies creativity. What is that distance between being a very good pattern matcher, being a very good kind of having access to all sorts of information and being able to bring that together, and then being able to make an intellectual jump to the next level, where you make a jump of intuition, if you will, to create something unique or novel or what have you. That's actually very difficult to quantify, I think. Writing music, I would argue, is such a thing. It's not merely a pattern matching exercise. There is an aesthetic to music. And for a number of years, people have been working in the creation of texts and stories and trying to get computers to write jokes. And in fact, computers have started to write jokes, which are perhaps to computer scientists funny. Maybe to the rest of us too, but it's a gradual slope on that, because I think that does require some level of creativity. But writing music is the interesting one, because this year is, I think, Beethoven's, I guess, 200th anniversary of his birth or something like this. And in commemoration of his 200th anniversary, a team of computer scientists are finishing his 10th symphony. And they're finishing his 10th symphony by taking all of Beethoven's work, bringing it together, putting it into an algorithm, and creating a finalized version, as it were, from Beethoven's own hand, but by using an algorithm to do it. And of course, the fascinating thing in that project, if you read closely between the small print, is that what's really happening is a computer has taken on all those patterns from Beethoven's work and is now generating potential lines that could be used. And in fact, humans are the ones then putting it together and making the choices about what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, where it works, what emotional content you want the piece to have. But of course, when it comes out, it will be presented not as, I'm sure, computer enhanced or computer aided, or in my language, intelligent augmentation of other composers. It will be presented as Beethoven kind of Deus ex machina, or Beethoven ex machina, a creation posthumously. So I think you have to read quite carefully with some of these things.
So you've touched a couple of times on one of the requirements of AI, which is really about vast quantities of data. And data inequality can lead to wealth inequality. So do you see AI as a further contributor to this gap?
Absolutely. I'm not sure how, given time, I don't want to get into this question too deeply, because it's A, very political, and B, we could spend an hour on this alone. But I was reading a fascinating book called AI Superpowers by a guy called Kai-Fu Lee, who is ex of Microsoft Research and who did a lot of work in China a few years back. But he makes the point very adeptly in his book that where you have data, you are going to have better AI. And where you have better AI, you are going to get deeper insights, faster insights. It will draw more people's data in, and you will get a data imbalance in the world. And we're already seeing this with China, because China has such a large population. I mean, 4 times the US population. You are seeing China conglomerating much more data than the rest of the world. And that helps their algorithms be better than anyone else's. Quite frankly, if you look at, I've done some studies recently on where the locus of AI research is, and it is very clearly that around 8 out of 10 of the world's top universities in AI research are in China. If you look at what Tsinghua University is doing right now in comparison to MIT, which would arguably be the leading university in the US, then these are quite frankly different scales of work right now. Tsinghua is incredibly well connected within China. The level of data that it has access to, the level of funding it has access to, is really putting its level of research a cut above almost everyone else's, in my opinion, if you look coldly at the data. And I think what that will tend to mean, as we saw with the Silicon Valley style revolution of computation in the 80s, you will see a very similar rush of talent, wealth, power towards people who are able to work with this technology. So I think you'll see multiple levels of imbalance. You'll see imbalance within countries, between countries, and you'll also see imbalance within countries. People who have control of data, people who are in a position to invest in AI now, will do disproportionately well compared to those who have more limited access either to data or the ability to invest in those technologies. And so I see that disparity. The 1% within 10 years will be the world's wealth is 0.1%, and you will see exactly the same thing. The one thing that we potentially have going for us now, and this sounds like a completely horrible thing to say at one level, is coronavirus. Coronavirus is creating a very different world condition right now, and we may see some rebalancing and releveling based on different wealth laws that come in following this crisis, because I think there will be a large-scale realization that healthcare should be universal at some level. We need to be able to put systems in place where we can pay people's salaries if we're having to stay in a small room for 8 hours a day and we can't leave our houses. So I think since I wrote the article, a global event has happened which could be a counterforce, a counterbalance.
So following on though from that thought about the requirement for data and the volume of data needed, how transparent do you think the gathering of data is by AI researchers and companies? And do you think we should be concerned?
I suspect the popular answer will be, no, you shouldn't be concerned. It's all fine, don't worry. I think the realistic answer is actually slightly more sinister. I went to the Falling Walls conference in Germany at the end of last year, and this is an absolutely lovely conference where they bring together lots of people who talk about the future and who talk about the walls that are going to fall in the next 12 months. It's a lovely concept and it's brilliantly done. And one of the speakers this year was from the AI Now Research Institute in New York University. And she talked very compellingly about how these technologies that are pervading our lives are taking data from us unwittingly, or, you know, we've signed the terms and conditions. And there's a joke, or there's a meme that goes around online about, you know, the biggest lie we all tell is, yes, I read the T's and C's. And I'm sure that many people on this haven't read the T's and C's. I haven't read the T's and C's. I couldn't even be completely sure that digital science T's and C's don't allow us to do things that we actually have no intention of doing, but that they might allow us to do those things. It depends the lens through which you look at the problem. And, you know, legal documents can be very complicated. So I think actually there's a fascinating piece of work to be done in evaluating T's and C's and seeing actually where we are right now, because I think this is actually a kind of an open question and something that I would actually be completely fascinated in doing more work on, finding out where people are taking data, people where they have the right to take the data, and potentially where that was part of the plan and where that wasn't part of the plan. So I think this could be quite an active research topic for someone. And given we have so many people on the call, they could each do one set of T's and C's And we could bring all those data together and we'd have a really interesting picture.
Well, I'd like to confess that I too do accept T's and C's that I haven't fully read myself. And I agree with you. I think it would be an absolutely fascinating project to take a look at some of these things and see the variants and actually what people are subscribing to without necessarily knowing. But moving on in terms of scholarly search engines. So some engines such as Meta and Yewno, where I work, use AI to power research in the STEM disciplines. How do these AI-powered search engines differ from traditional keyword searching? And what value do you think they can potentially add to researchers?
You're actually much better placed to answer this question than me, Ruth. So I will try to find an answer that hopefully isn't too embarrassing and showing too much of my ignorance of the area. I think if you think about traditional keyword search engines, they were really the first generation, or still really building on the first generation of search engine technology. And that really relates to, in my mind, it relates to solutions of problems that are really trying to highlight popularity. And so when you are looking at a more complex landscape, as I think we all know we are now, for me, one of the things that we sought to do with Dimensions, which does use AI, but not in the way that you guys do at Yewno, we were looking to create context for people. And we were looking to give people search results which gave them a broader profile of an area that they could then relate to and understand in a different way. I think things like Yewno, the idea is to move away from popularity and move towards context in a different way. And I think that's incredibly valuable because the volume of information that we have available to us now, the flow of the information, the rate of flow, these are all absolutely massive. I'll give you one terribly quick example in that we, at Digital Science, we created a COVID-19 portal showing people the publications that are coming out on COVID-19. In most research areas that are as small as a particular strain of virus, you would expect, a couple of hundred papers a year. The whole coronavirus community historically have produced around 3,000 papers a year. But through text mining and having that full view of data, we have, as of today, in Dimensions, seen more than 13,500 papers since January.
Wow.
Which is a staggering number. And this is precisely the kind of corpus and the kind of situation where a system like Dimensions can highlight the problem and we can give you context around grants given and patents awarded and where the clinical trials are coming from, and where I think Yewno can add a different perspective and Meta can add a different perspective, showing you perhaps a little more what the related areas are. If you want to know about COVID-19, what else should you know about? What are the adjacencies? What are the dependencies? And so I think these systems together start to form a different set of tools for allowing people a much faster insight into something which the human brain simply can't get its head around with this speed.
I do agree with you. I think in terms of the volume of information that's available and is continuously created, it is completely overwhelming. And that context and that different perspective can only be done at scale by some kind of machine. But moving on to rocket science, I once read a book about rocket science that demonstrated the profound importance of speculative science fiction and the efforts of enthusiastic amateurs in the founding of modern rocketry. What's your view of the relation between science fiction and AI?
So it will surprise no one here that I'm a massive Star Trek fan. I'm probably one of the larger geeks in the room. For me, it's been really, really interesting. I mean, obviously, there's a long history of AI in science fiction, from Isaac Asimov through to things like Blade Runner and Star Trek itself. But what was really interesting to me, I mean, Star Trek has a special place in many people's hearts. When it came out in the 1960s, it was this very positive view of the world. And the aim was really to conceptualize the future as a positive collaborative environment. And I think that certainly in the time which Star Trek came out, that was very much was very much a hope. And I think in many ways the world did unfold in that way for several years, certainly until more recent events. And I think that the usage of Star Trek-like technologies has been quite fascinating. I mean, we all have iPads. iPads are a thing out of Star Trek The Next Generation, and within a few years we're holding them. The original clam phones, you'll probably all remember, are just like Star Trek communicators from 1960s. We haven't yet got the phasers, but here's hoping. The most recent Star Trek series, Star Trek Picard, has its central theme, artificial intelligence, and the relationship between humanity and artificially intelligent life forms. In a particular juxtaposed way, in fact. I mean, it's quite an interesting story from a sociological perspective. And so I do think that science fiction has a lot to own when it comes to our relationship to artificial intelligence, how we think about it. I think Steven Pinker recently wrote, maybe in Enlightenment Now, that it's interesting that we define artificial intelligence and the capabilities of artificial intelligence very much relative to our own intelligence as humanity. And we don't really think about it as going beyond intelligence or what other forms of intelligence it might take or might have. And I think more than any other field, science fiction has probably tried to explore that concept in interesting ways and try to understand what AI means for humanity and what humanity's relationship should be with it. And I don't think, it's not that I don't think science hasn't gone there, but it's probably too speculative for many serious scientists to go as far as science fiction is able to go. Because in some sense, science fiction has very little to lose. So long as there's a good storyline, we'll lap it up and we'll enjoy it. But with science, I think there has to be some basis in reality. And sometimes that can be quite limiting. So I think science fiction certainly has its role in understanding what relationship we should have, what the capabilities could be, and just thinking slightly laterally about the types of problems that we're going to experience as AI becomes increasingly a part of our society.
Thank you. So I think thinking about AI in science fiction is a great stimulant and for ideas. And I think the more worrying side of it is really when people start worrying about their jobs, etc. And that's been mentioned earlier on in your talk and in your chapter. And we've also got a few questions popping up in the Q&A. So you mentioned that in previous economic and social revolutions, such as the Industrial Revolution, that people created machines that made one person's labor more productive. The AI revolution, though, is allowing us to build machines that can actually improve themselves and make themselves more productive. So can you give us maybe an example of this in research technology and what you think the impact might be?
Sure, this is a little bit more of a subtle point. I mean, I think we are at the beginning of this kind of exponential revolution. And exponential because precisely of this effect where AI can produce AI, which produces AI, and you have this multiplicative effect or geometric effect of the growth. I think the logical kind of focus, given where we are technologically right now, would be precisely in this pattern matching space. Right now, we are applying pattern matching to fairly low-level things like working out what you might want to read. I think that's immensely dangerous. I don't think an AI should tell me what to read. And I don't think that it should be used to rank or rate research, which is, I'm absolutely sure, the metrics conversation that we had 10 years ago about using H to hire people and thinking about whether journal impact factors are a good thing. Metrics are becoming more under control through things like DORA, people having more experience and understanding their limitations. I'm absolutely certain we are about to move into an era where we start to think about how AI can be used to rate, rank, peer review research, and how it can all be automated. And of course, this is in my view completely wrong thinking. This is not the way to go. However, if you take a step beyond that and you think about where we can be designing systems that help augment our intelligence, then I think you start to get some beginnings of this kind of exponential revolution effect. I'll tell you about one company that I have encountered that's based between Cambridge, UK and Switzerland. And they have this fantastic technology. The company, if I can remember the name, is called Iprova, IPRova. And they have this fantastic algorithm which helps you try to be innovative. And it has done a scan of all sorts of literature and has this large knowledge graph and can exercise that knowledge graph to come up with innovations for you. So one innovation that this team have come up with, which I think is absolutely great, is that they have read the literature, the machine has read the literature, it understands that picking up your mobile phone is difficult because it's becoming thinner and thinner and people are having trouble actually grabbing it off the table. It also knows that the mobile phone has within it a charging pad at the back so that you can charge this wirelessly. And it knows that it has a motion sensor. You see, as I get close to my phone, it switches on and the light comes on because it knows my hand is nearby. It also knows basic physics. So it knows that I could have this on a charging pad, and as I bring my hand close to it, it will reverse the polarity of the charge in the charger or in the back of the phone and make the phone jump so it will be easier for me to take hold of. So that's just an example of a type of innovation that has actually been suggested by the AI. This is very parallel, I think, to the Beethoven example that we talked about earlier. And so this is the type of situation where I think you could, in the next few years, not only see AIs coming up with basic types of innovation, but designing the next AI which would design the next innovation. So I think we're again at the beginnings of that revolution where I think you could see things becoming kind of tiered up or stepped up through a chain of innovative AIs. And in a research context, you can see how that could be quite useful in solving particular challenges in the lab, or having an AI suggest to you different research avenues or different paths that might be interesting to look at.
Well, thank you very much. These are a couple of very positive kind of angles. But over the past 5 years, I've been asked a number of times about AI and bias, and it's something that I think is really on everyone's mind. And I know it's a big, big question and a big, big area, but can I ask you to give us your opinion?
So this is actually a well-trodden path, so I don't want to give a long answer in this situation. The situation that I think about most frequently with this is actually the matrix point that I talked about just a moment ago. In my view, we are starting to develop technologies. Google has a great research group on this that's working on a technology called TCAV. And TCAV is a technology that allows you to try to look inside the mind of a deep learning algorithm. Typically, deep learning algorithms are the ones that are producing a lot of the hot research right now. This is a very active research area, but it's also an area where it's very difficult to see how the machine is learning. And so Google have come up with a methodology that allows you to start to interrogate the learning process itself and to try to understand how that deep learning process is learning and to discover its biases. The problem that I actually have with this overall kind of bias is that bias can be very subtle. We all laugh when we see stuff online. There was a thing on YouTube where one guy put their hand under a soap dispenser and the soap dispenser dispensed the soap. Another colleague came and put their hand under the soap dispenser and it wouldn't dispense any soap. And of course it wouldn't dispense soap because it had been trained to think that white skin was human and that there weren't any other types of skin. So the data that had been fed in completely biased towards what defined a human and didn't define anybody who wasn't white to be a human, which is obviously a, a pretty critical error and a very embarrassing one, but also very obvious. And obvious things like this, of course, cause a lot of public furor and a lot of concern, but it's actually not the obvious things we should worry about, it's the unobvious things, the things that are difficult to pick up on and difficult to explain. And this is why I said earlier, I don't think AI should ever be used to peer review or rate or rank research. Because the correctness of a piece of research or the appropriateness of a piece of research is not just pattern matching. It is understanding the full context of the piece of research. It is giving some kind of deep insight into the piece of research. Whether it's well written or not is important, and computers have a kind of a mixed view on what is well written. There are many facets to this, and I feel colossally uncomfortable about the idea that someone could come along and automate peer review. I think my biggest fear with that, and this is already happening to some extent in systems that already exist, evaluation systems that already exist, we tend as humans to go with the majority decision. There have been a lot of cognitive bias experiments on this. You can get people to say entirely opposite to what they think by putting them in certain contexts. So we're guilty of this ourselves. But I think that through metrics, the problem has become more extreme. I think we tend to fund popular research rather than good research. And that's a kind of a controversial statement. I can back it up to some level. And I think we exacerbate that problem at an incredibly increased rate if we trust in AI to rank research. Because if you look at what's published and how it's published and the patterns of publishing, a much less obvious trend is that we tend to move towards established opinions. We tend to move towards things that are popular. And if someone starts to tell you, I can help you as a publisher understand what you should pick because it will be more cited and consequently more valuable in some evaluation of some description, then you have already crossed the line. You have created a system which is going to evaluate popular research more strongly than other research. And I think that's a very dangerous path for the whole of research.
Thank you. So looking at another area of concern, I've heard librarians say that the research environment is so complicated and confusing that you need librarians to help navigate it in some cases. And I'm interested in how you think academic research libraries could be transformed potentially in a sort of 5-year time frame, if AI could actually help mitigate some of the current complexity of the research ecosystem.
This is an interesting point. I mean, I think that libraries fulfill more than one purpose. They are certainly not just about getting books or getting journals or having access to literature. I also think that there are some parts of the research ecosystem that need complexity. I'm a big believer in making things simple where you can make them, but preserving complexity where that complexity adds something critical. And I think some of the complexity around the research process and some of the complexity that we find ourselves in is necessary complexity. I also think that part of the human interaction or the human experience of doing research is actually rather critical. One of the things that I point out in the book chapter is if we keep employing technologies like transcriptic across the whole research ecosystem, at some level we don't need PhD students and we don't need postdocs, because a lot of the a lot of the work that they have to do on a day-to-day basis could be automated. And in automating that work, this isn't trying to do down PhD students and postdocs. They do other things as well. But a lot of the reason that we want to employ them and that we can have so many of them is because they're doing work that is actually helping them understand how research works. It's exactly the same, you know, I know how to multiply numbers on a piece of paper, and I know how to divide numbers on a piece of paper. There are some people who are now going through school who don't know how to do that because a computer does it. And why should they know how to do it? But I actually fundamentally believe one should know how to do such things. There is actually a method on paper that you can do to calculate square roots that my father was taught, but that I wasn't taught. And so you can see generation by generation, there are different gaps in our knowledge that we maybe aren't even aware of. So I think that there continues to be a role for certain things to be done in a certain way, because it teaches you how to think, and it teaches you how to interact with information and how to interact with others. And I think to lose those skills means that you start losing access to the core information, and you start losing the ability to understand and conceptualize what you may have missed. And I think that's where librarians and information professionals have an immense role to play in whatever future happens. It is about teaching people to understand how to think about the information that could be out there.
So I totally agree with you that that human element is definitely irreplaceable. And taking this into sort of a bigger picture kind of environment. So many people, not always scientists, have been saying for decades that AI is about to fundamentally transform society and that everything will be different in 5 years. So here we are in 2020. Do you think that this could possibly be true this year, or do you think we might see some fundamental shifts in the next 5 years?
If you think about where we were 5 years ago and the AIs that we had available to us 5 years ago, and the AIs that you're actually completely unaware of now that are interacting with your life, it will only get faster. I think that we will see automation of things that we don't even realize are being automated. In a way that we, in an even more extreme way than we are currently. I've interacted with help systems and computer systems recently, which just blew me away in terms of their ability to understand my problem, their ability to direct me to the correct solution. And they were pleasant to interact with. From a completely different area, I did some work last year on automated cars and automated driving, autonomous vehicles. And again, the kind of strides that are being made in that area are colossal. The ability to, it's no longer, and actually this is one of the areas, going back to one of my earlier comments, that has actually started to conceptualize beyond the human. They have started to think, okay, how do we get to 0 deaths on the road? How do we, given that a human has very limited perception of the world and very limited processing power of the world around them, how can we put a computer in place that perceives so much of the world that it can always make the better decision? And for that group of people, which is an organization called AIDA, the Automated Drivers Association, that they are looking at, by 2030, 0 road deaths. And I think that's a fascinating thing. I think one of the most obvious things we may see in the next decade is humans, first of all, going to a stage where you see many more robots on the road driving. And the second stage will be humans not being allowed to drive on the roads because they're not considered sufficiently safe. And I think that switch, much as the COVID switch has pushed things much faster in things like home delivery, use of systems like Zoom and our interaction here, I think you will see a sea change in how quickly car usage, the patterns of car usage change going forwards. And I'm sure, I don't necessarily know what they all are, but I'm sure that there will be things in research that go the same route, where it simply won't be socially acceptable to do certain types of experiments in certain ways because you can't be trusted to do it as well as the computer.
That's a really interesting perspective. And I think, you know, looking at the questions that are coming in, so one of them is about research and the fact that some of it is poor quality and can't be reproduced. And could AI help in terms of reducing the amount of research? So I think it's reasonable that AI could help science by generating some kind of structured report of research. And I'll ask you to comment further. And taking that to the next step, do you think somebody would actually ever want to read a novel written by AI?
So close to home, last year the first AI book came out from our sister company at Springer Nature. They did a piece of work with a set of academics at the University of Heidelberg, and they created a set of algorithms which created the first automated book on lithium-ion batteries. It is a riveting read, especially if you're a lithium-ion battery researcher. It went through a full peer review process. Unbeknownst to the reviewers, they were reviewing a summarization of research, a review of research written by a computer. And the feedback was that it was a little dry. The researchers felt it was well positioned, had the right content, the content was appropriate and said true things, and that it was a little dry to read. And I think once you get to that level, that's quite interesting. I mean, I put a vision out there to my team about 5 years ago, and I said, in the next few years, you will get to a situation where researchers will wake up in the morning and say to their AI, please write me a review on the following articles and the following research objects, data sets, interrelate them and kind of have it for me on my desk by the time I get into the office. And I really can see that world coming within the next few years now. But I still see it as fundamentally as not a creative act, but as a bringing together, a synergistic act. So it's a synthesis of work rather than the creation of new knowledge. At best, I think you might hope that it would bring together suggestions for things that might be interesting, areas that might be helpful. But I think that again starts to fall into the trap of only doing popular things. I think it's very tricky to make this intellectual leap, to bring together two things, two experiences from completely disparate places and see the link between them. That's quite difficult to do. To the point you made on reproducibility, when Matthew introduced me, he mentioned Repeater, which is a technology which does precisely this. It looks at manuscripts to see whether they are reproducible. And to try to understand the reproducibility of a manuscript. And the team there, led by Leslie McIntosh at the University of Washington University in St. Louis, in fact, has created a very advanced system, in my view, that is able to look over a research manuscript and give feedback to the author on how the reproducibility of the presentation might be improved. And I know that they've done a lot of work on the ontology of how that should look. And they now have something like 42 different checks that they can perform on a manuscript, which give you different aspects of the reproducibility of the work.
Thank you. I mean, thank you so much, Daniel, for answering this hugely broad range of questions and for the very specific examples. We're reaching the end of our hour, so I'd like to hand back to Matthew. As Leah mentioned in the beginning, we've got an awful lot of participants here and a huge number of questions in the channel, which we probably can't answer all of now, but I know that Daniel's very kindly said he can hang on for a few more minutes. So Matthew, if I could hand back to you and maybe you could select which questions you think we can most appropriately answer at this point.
Okay, thanks very much. I think one of the questions when we're talking about scholarly research is AI and language translation in scholarly communication. That is, how well does Google Translator and a similar AI work for a scholar who does not speak or read a given language?
So I think what's quite interesting here is that just a few years ago, Google Translate was actually completely rules-based. And very subtly, I think it was in a September, 3 or 4 years ago, they switched from the rules-based engine to an AI-based engine, which was a learning algorithm. And so I think you can already see I have certainly noticed Google Translate become more accurate in its translation capability. I still think we're quite a long way from perfect, and we're certainly quite a long way from being able to just translate a manuscript with Google and forget. But it will continue to get better, and it will continue to get better and better. The amounts of data that are being fed into Google Translate are just colossal. And with Google's parallel work in things like quantum computation, clock cycles are not going to be the issue for them within 10 years. It is going to be much more about volume of data than it is processing power. I think that the Google quantum computation team have really stolen the march on many other researchers in some of the approaches that they're taking right now. I'm quite impressed by the work. And quantum computation is the kind of computational power I think you need to solve these language problems at scale in a good way. One of our companies, Rightful, does some work in this field and looks usually at how to help you write better English, given you're already writing English. But certainly the AI behind that technology is created by linguists who understand the structure of language and who know how to think about how other people think about English. If I'm using Google Translate and I want to translate into French, which is my second language, I don't write my English in English that I want to double check. I write it in a form of English that I know will translate into the French that I have in mind. And I think that's the kind of line of thinking that you need to take as a step on the way to this higher level of translation. And so I know that there are people working on the problem in that kind of way. And I think that in itself is kind of interesting.
Okay, let me ask you another one here. We have lots and lots of research being produced of varying qualities, and much of it simply cannot be reproduced, the methodology. Could AI help reduce the amount of research that's being done by eliminating a lot of the lower level research that is not adequately performed?
This is a tricky one, actually. I would say that you don't need AI to get rid of that level of research. I mean, there's part of me, the researcher in me says there's no redundant research at some level, because people interacting with ideas and iterating and thinking about things deeply is generally a good thing. And they may find a wrinkle or an approach or some different way of working on a problem that no one else has seen, which could become valuable. That's the kind of platonic, high level, everything is beautiful kind of view. If you think about duplicative research, I think that is a much larger waste point in our system. There is so much research that is done that is simply reproducing something that someone else has done, which they haven't shared and told anyone about. And I think that's not an AI problem, that's an open data problem, or an ability to publish negative results problem. And so systems like Figshare, like Dryad, the people who are at the Centre for Open Science and all of their work, this is around trying to reduce and remove that problem. I don't see an obvious use for AI that would actually take you a significant step above of that kind of work at the moment. Maybe Yewno could point out to you that you're doing a piece of work that's already been done. Ruth, what do you think?
So it's a really interesting one. And I think going back to kind of one of the problems we talked about at the beginning about sort of just the volume of information, one of the things we've started to do recently is work with news. And I think many people probably, get this overwhelming volume of news every day, and then they read a story and they realize it's exactly the same as the other story that they read. So I think there definitely are kind of areas where AI can massively help in terms of duplication. So rather than scanning and reading 17 variations of, in fact, an identical story, pull them all together. You can say, oh, okay, I can see it's the same story, 17 sources. I'm going to click and I'm going to read the story from my preferred source, but I'm not going to waste my time looking at 17. And I think it goes to sort of the problem that you mentioned earlier, Daniel, where, can it pull together and summarize rather than a human getting up at 5 o'clock to be in the office at 6 o'clock to read everything before their boss comes in at 8:30? Can a machine do it? And I think the answer is absolutely yes in that type of situation, which is much more clear cut. So yeah, I would say that's an area that has a lot of potential. And I think it's a kind of positive potential in the sense that, you're not taking away the interesting part of somebody's job, you're taking away a quite boring, mundane part of somebody's job, and you're removing that level of frustration and giving it to a machine that can just do it in a fraction of the time and then leave you with more time to do the interesting part of your job, which is, reading the stuff that you actually wanted to read rather than searching for it and reading it 20 times.
You might even think of it as some kind of intelligent augmentation.
One might, Daniel, one might.
Let's do one last, one last question. How do you define reality in the AI environment?
Goodness. That's I guess someone's trying to, what they're trying to, I'm going to interpret that question because I think it is open to massive interpretation. I'm going to interpret it as a question effectively about things like news bubbles, because I think that's probably the most relevant and timely interpretation, although I will fully admit there are other interpretations one could take. And the way I'm going to frame this is I'm going to think about the world as one where you're consuming media, you're consuming things from the television, you're consuming things on Twitter and through Facebook and your social avatar in information space, whatever that is, and you consume through the lens of an AI rather than directly. And if you extend that to the example I gave about auto-summarization and writing of a research paper or writing a journal, then indeed, if you are abstracted away from the source material, how do you know what you're reading is really what the author intended, is really what the data says? Because you're now reading a coarse-grained version of something that didn't have contact with the original physicality of the experiment or whatever it was. So I think this is a very philosophical point and quite an existential point. And I would argue, in fact, that it's a problem that we deal with on a daily basis today. When I read a piece of research from anyone, how do I trust it? How do I know that the paper I'm reading right now really does tell me about results that a human really did find and that they really did actually work on? How do I know it's not a fabrication? How do I know it's not a research result that they wanted to have where they've added noise on top so that it looks somewhat kind of realistic and that there's variance in there? And I think it goes also to the bias question that I talked about earlier. That is also intrinsic within this conceptualization of the world. And I think it's very tough. I don't think we yet have technologies to handle that. I don't think we as humans have the experience to handle that terribly well. There was a lovely piece of research I read recently that says, we default to trust. We default to trust people because if we don't, society becomes unworkable. I think this was a point that Gladwell made in his most recent book about meeting strangers. And In the same way as Gladwell points out in society, the same is true in research. We trust research from certain sources and from certain groups, certain people, certain jurisdictions, certain subject areas with different levels of ease. And I think the same will become true of AIs. You will, if the summarization has come from a particular AI, you will trust certain aspects of that and not other aspects of it. You will know that this particular AI has a bias towards this because your colleague told you about it when you were chatting over the water cooler. I think it will be that kind of very human experience, actually. I don't think it will, and ultimately, I think this is actually something where we do fall down in the current research system. We don't fund reproduction enough. There aren't enough grants available for people who say, actually, I need to systematically reproduce this piece of research because I've identified this as being super important. I need to reproduce this. I need someone to fund me to reproduce that work. And of course, then we get to the whole problem around work that isn't reproducible. Taking readings from a one-off event, some star goes supernova, we collect the data from the supernova, there's no way I can reproduce that event. That was a star going supernova. There are loads of sociological experiments that can't be reproduced. And so there's always going to be this ambiguity, this slight trust in things that we have to overcome, and this abstracted level of trust, which you have in the same way that you have that your Apple Watch is going to do the thing that you think it's going to do, or that your alarm clock is going to wake you up at the right time in the morning, given that someone can now hack into your alarm clock remotely and switch it off if they so wish to. So I think there are, yeah, I think this is a really challenging topic and one which would take a lot longer to go into, but that's kind of a high level take on it for you.
That's great. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Daniel. There's Leah.
There we go. And with that, we are going to close today's webinar. I wanted to say thank you very much to Matthew and Ruth and Daniel for putting today's talk together. It was fantastic. I learned a lot. A lot of it was over my head, but it was fascinating. And it was great to learn a lot on a new subject for me. So just another quick reminder that this session was recorded and we're going to send the link to everyone within a day or two. And this is part 1 of a 3-part series. So we are going to have part 2 on May 20th and part 3 on June 17th with different speakers on different topics on the subject of artificial intelligence and scholarly research. So I hope you can make it for those sessions as well. If you have any questions or comments that we were not able to address during the Q&A session, you can send those to me. My email address is there. It's leah@charlestonlibraryconference.com, and I can forward those on to our panelists and get some answers for you. So thanks again for everyone who attended and participated. Take a quick poll after the session is ended as 3 questions to give us your feedback on today's session, and hopefully we'll see you back here next time in May. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you, Matthew, Daniel, and Ruth. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.